A loud crack pierces the air as a guttural hiss escapes the fearsome maw. The valiant monster slayer falls to his knees, exhausted. The hard outer carapace of the beast was nothing like he ever experienced before. The beast was a Dreugh, a large crustacean-like creature who, throughout its life cycle, lives on either the land or in the water. These are another one of Tamriel's mysterious creatures, because they are not just a simple monster. Some historians believe them to be a race in their own right, yet in the modern ages of Tamriel, they seem to have devolved into a cantankerous crustacean. In the ages when the wild was all that reigned over the lands of Nirn, the Dreugh walked the world. They were once possibly even the rulers of the entire known world. This allegation derives from Mankar Cameron's text, the Mythic Dawn Commentaries Volume 4. The first paragraph states, "May the holder of the fourth key know the heart thereby. The Mundex terrain was once ruled over solely by the tyrant Dreugh kings, each to their own dominion, and border wars fought between their slave oceans. They were akin to the time totems of old, yet evil, and full of mockery and profane powers. No one that lived did so outside of the sufferance of the Dreughs." There is a lot to unpack here, so let us get right into it. First, Cameron claims the Dreughs once ruled over all of the Mundex terrain, also known as Mundus, or best known as Nirn. Since we don't know much of anything about Nirn other than the history of Tamriel and that of the ancient people that settled it, we can't discredit whether or not the Dreugh had such a vast empire on the other continents. What we do know about Nirn was it was ruled by dragons before the time of men, and I personally have a hard time believing that the dragons bow down to the Dreugh. This doesn't mean that their great empire on Nirn did not exist, though. If the life cycle of the Dreugh was the same in ancient times as it is in modern times, they only inhabit the land for 1 year of their lives so they can reproduce. Because of this, I believe they could have lived in unition, not necessarily harmony, but they may have tolerated one another as long as they did not encroach on each other's territory. On the other hand, they may have just had their empire in the sea, in and around present-day Morrowind. Dreugh population is the most dense in this area in the modern day, so it would be safe to assume it has always been this way. History also suggests that the Dreugh were devolved from their state of higher intelligence, due to the constant conflict they sustained with the Dunmer who hunted them for their wax and hide. If they had their vast empire here, I don't think it would be totally far-fetched to believe they could have ruled at the same time as the dragons. Now, on to the next portion. The text talks of the Dreughs having separate dominions that they waged border wars against with their slave oceans. Yet again, there is much left to interpretation here. First, I find it interesting that they have separate dominions. This confirms that they were intelligent beings at a time and were capable of forming kingdoms of sort. The text also refers to border wars, implying that their conflicts consisted of much more than meager territorial disputes, yet again suggesting they truly were similar to the beast races of modern-day Tamriel. Lastly for this verse is the reference to slave oceans. To me this sounds as though the Dreugh enslaved the beings of the ocean and forced them to battle against their enemies. Lastly, Mankar Cameron compares the Dreugh to the time totems of old. Yet, they were more cruel and evil. I was unable to find much on said time totems, so I must make my own comparisons. The most sensible comparison to something referred to as a time totem will be the Elder Scrolls. This is because they know all that has been and all that will be, and they can even alter time itself. This doesn't make much sense to me, however, because how can a tyrannical being compared to something like an Elder Scroll? This leaves me with a last-ditch idea, and that is that the time totems are the dragons themselves. I think this may be the case because dragons are supposed to mark the beginning and end of time, with Akatosh being the dragon god of time, so his offspring could be his time totems. Also, Alduin is supposed to mark the end of the world and the beginning of a new world, hence his name of the World Eater. The thought of tyrannical rulers that somehow are more cruel than the dragons is hard to believe, and it doesn't seem to fit into the timeline of Elder Scrolls lore. Now, there is a ridiculous amount of uncanon lore you can dive into. I found most of it on Reddit, and most of it comes from the writings of Michael Kirkbride, who was once the lore master for the Elder Scrolls series. His last work was on Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. Since then, he has released unlicensed texts, most of which has lore on the Elder Scrolls universe. This work, however, is uncanon, so take most information past this point in the video with a grain of salt. The Dreugh may have been the rulers of a world, but that doesn't have to be Nirn. They may have been the dragon equivalents to a world called Lig. Lig is, in the most simplest terms, a parallel universe that exists both ahead and before Nirn all at once. This means anything that could happen on Nirn is happening on Lig. So, the Dreugh may be the tyrant ocean rulers of Lig at some point. Also, let us imagine the Dreugh more as a race of elves at this point and not the barbaric crabs we know them as. Now you may ask how they came to be the Dreugh as we know them, so here it goes. Lig can bleed over into the world of Nirn at any time, so they in their ocean could have bled on to Tamriel, not too unlike the conjunction of the spheres in the Witcher lore. This transition may have altered their being, leaving them as the brutal crustaceans we know, and then they did their best to establish their own empire on Tamriel, yet failed to do so, leaving them to get hunted into a lesser being by the Dunmer. This is all very confusing and totally not confirmed in any way, yet to me it somehow makes more sense than them living in union with the dragons. Now, with that convoluted history lesson behind us, let's discuss what we truly know of the Dreugh. Biologically, they come in two different varieties, water dregs and land dregs, also known as billies. The land dregs are believed to be living in a stage meant for breeding, which only lasts for about a year, known as carnivism. This would also validate their excessive aggression, as most creatures in a mating cycle are more aggressive. During this stage, they still stay near either the sea or marshy areas. While above water, they create nests, mate, and produce eggs, which eventually turn into little baby dregs. Their eggs are also known to be quite the delicacy to some, so they must defend them valiantly from poachers. Once carvinasm is complete, the Dreugh meth. Mething is when they lurk back into the depths and devour their land skin and armor, assuming their water form. They then produce grom, which is basically a lobster hairball containing the remnants of their former carapace. These globules emit a foul smell and are quite worthless. There is another theory by an independent scholar formed via his own research that claims land and water dregs are completely different subspecies, but this is not the officially believed biological composure of the dregs. Lastly, on the biological spectrum, they seem to float around the top of the food chain, whether it be under or above water. They maintain an omnivorous diet, eating just about anything that can fit in their brutal maw. They have even been observed devouring felled men and myrrh. Their most important weapon, the fell things, seemingly more powerful than them, is a burst of non-magical electrical energy. For the last section, I will detail multiple miscellaneous facts about the dregs that I could not work into the rest of this script. First, the dregs in legend had a deity they worshipped known as the Ruddy Man, who was the father of the Dreugh. He is either a manifestation of Molag Bal or an offspring brought forward from the union of Bal and Vivec, which I do refuse to go into further. Vivec later went on to defeat this Ruddy Man and forced his people into giving the Dunmer their hide for armor. Next, according to some tales, the intelligent Dreugh that walked Nirn built stone structures such as cairns, but there is no archaeological evidence of this, so I did not deem it worthy of mention earlier. Lastly, as mentioned earlier, Dreugh eggs and meat are considered delicacies to some. Whether or not this is because you have to face death to get it or just because it's good is unknown. The flesh when cooked is reportedly similar to crab, and their eggs probably make good omelets. I really don't know. Well, there it is, the highly requested. At least, for me. Culmination of Dreugh lore. Half of this information is almost sheer speculation, so forgive me. When dealing with a creature like this, with very little truly known lore, you must sometimes take liberties to make an entertaining video. Ironically enough, the theory which lacks canon proof is the most likely to me. Let me know what you think of these crusty crustaceans down below. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I hope to see you in the next video.